Next part of the program that's been underway is phenotyping, and this has been run by Dr. Tricia Johnson, who's a senior scientist at Invermay. Tricia completed her PhD through Massey University in conjunction with Invermay, from which the Myomax Texel muscling gene test was developed. Tricia has worked in this area of meat genetics for a number of years, but is currently shifting her focus more into the maternal traits. When not working on science, you can find her farming with a family on a 5,000 stock unit property between Middlemarch and Macrae's Flat. But her mind is always on the science. So, Tricia, okay.
So most of you are used to me standing up here talking meat, so this is going to be quite different this year. The two areas that we kind of have started to work on within the phenotyping are around what I'm going to refer to as novel devices and also the feed efficiency. So phenotyping is not going to drop our weight traits and our meat and everything, and some of those are picked up in other programs, but this is the start of 5 years of building new traits into the future. We certainly know that we're not going to get the full breadth of work out within 5 years, but this is the start of moving to the future where some of these new traits can actually go. So the novel devices one is just like with the DNA technology that we've heard John McEwen talk about, is that there are a whole lot of technologies that are being used within human fields, whether it's on humans themselves or within commercial operations. And it is really looking towards some of these novel devices to try and capture data in our hill country environments and in some of our lowland that is not always possible. So the example for one of the examples is around activity loggers. So this is the iWatch that is being marketed at some exorbitant amount of money, but it can capture any amount of data from heart rate through to altitude, through to GPS type tracking to movements. And so we want to be able to develop an animal equivalent. We certainly don't want the cost of a iWatch running around on our sheep on the hills, but the technology is there to actually be able to collect some kind of data. So when we put the ewes out onto the hills at weaning, a property I visited in May, they go out into a massive area over summer and are expected to be able to maintain, if not put on body condition. Where do those ewes go during that time? Do some scavenge and forage better to be able to come back in pre-mating in better condition and to be able to understand some of that. So the technologies are close, not quite there yet, and that's what some of this research program will be about, is to develop some of these technologies, put them on some ewes over in pilot studies in the first couple of years, but building up the data set over the next few years to be able to actually understand, do we actually have variability? Certainly there would be some breeds that would argue that the breed has better attributes when it comes to some of these things, so it's about developing a data set for that. Proximity loggers. This is not going to be a replacement for DNA. They're not the most accurate, perfect things. However, they do offer us an opportunity to be able to actually collect a whole lot of data in our hill country environments that we would not otherwise be able to collect. So the whole idea of a proximity logger is it can be a Bluetooth technology or some kind of technology whereby if an animal has one of these in its ear and another animal has it in its ear, is that any time they come within a specified distance, they actually ping and talk to each other, and so you get a record of interactions between animals. So the idea is to actually do this kind of maybe in the multiplier or some of these commercial type operations where we're wanting to get more ewe data going back in, have the ewes with them on, whack in one of these tags at tailing, send them out, don't have it turn on for that first few hours when chaos ensues, but that night have it turn on and see which ewes and which lambs actually establish themselves together. So the idea that a ewe and her lambs are, that's a very tight bond. I say that I sit there and do science at home, I sit there and watch just how tight those bonds actually are. So to be able to get this kind of data is going to be a relative no-brainer. But it is going to have a whole lot of other applications once we actually develop up the technologies, in terms of if we've actually got it on our hoggets and we've got them on the teasers, actually being able to get date of onset of puberty, or to then go ahead and also look at mating date, increased proximity between the ewes and the rams. If it doesn't happen 17 days later, you know you've got your date of conception. So a whole lot of ideas are very much in the pilot phase again. So last year was about the review of the data. This year is going to be a little pilots once we get the technologies up and running. But it's really about trying to take some of these technologies from the human field. In both of these areas, Australian groups are very interested in working with us. So again, kind of like the SNP chips, different end uses of the technology, but we might be able to collaborate to get the technology to price points where we can really get them cheap enough to make some useful data come into our systems. So feed efficiency is another area, and I was glad to see there was at least one person up there that had something about feed efficiency. So feed efficiency, I again did a review of the literature over the previous year, and the most common referred to measure of feed efficiency is this idea of residual feed intake, which is the difference between the actual feed that an animal eats and that is what it is required based on its live weight and how much it's gaining in its fat depots. So, and the residual feed intake being the difference between that actual and the predicted. So the gold standard would be to actually have something that we could actually be measuring out in the paddocks to actually measure feed intake, because that's where the animals obviously are. Anybody who has any knowledge in this area will have heard of alkane capsules or chromium oxide capsules. They've been worked on quite a lot extensively in Australia, but they just don't really go on to deliver the type of information that we actually need. So if we go to the literature and have a look at what is being done worldwide, pretty much all of the work in this area has been done in cattle, and we're obviously sitting with one of the gurus in this field, Jason Archer, from his previous life in Australia, who has done a lot of the work in cattle literature. A review that came out last year reviewed all the cattle literature and came up with a pooled heritability of, surprise, surprise, 0.33. But there was a huge amount of variation there. One of the key things that comes out of that literature, though, is that there is evidence of a negative genetic correlation between feed efficiency, or between RFI and reproductive traits. So slight delayed onset of puberty and slight delays in return to estrus. So that's something that we have to keep in mind, and I'll touch on in a second. But one of the things that they have been able to show, which is one of the questions that we really have, is that there is a genetic repeatability between measurements on a growing animal, so sometime post-weaning, and that of an adult. So what about sheep? Well, the answer is that there is absolutely no data set in the world that can answer all of these questions for sheep. There have been bits that have been done on terminal sire breeds over in the States, and there's quite a lot of animals go through a testing facility over there. The Australians have started a little bit of work in merinos in this area in Western Australia, but nothing's published yet. There's a group in Melbourne who are setting up pretty much identical facility to what we're talking about. But these questions around these reproductive traits, genetic correlations, we know nothing. We just don't have this information for sheep. And obviously, if there's any delay in the onset of estrus, or puberty, in hoggets, that could have quite big impacts. So the long-term plan, we are looking to set up an automated feed intake facility. We just can't do it in the pasture. It's just not realistic at this point in time. So we're setting up an automated feed intake facility between Invermay and Outram, which will be able to house 200 hoggets per year, which will be measured in winter, with the aim being by June next year we'll have our first intake. So we're having these automated feed intake bins set up. There are equivalents for cattle. GrowSafe is the most common one, but a whole lot of different groups have set up their own ones. In the meantime, we've set up a pilot trial, and if you come and see my poster after lunch, this was last year's work. The poster is about what's actually underway at the moment. I very much realise that pelleted feed is not what animals actually eat in the hill country, but in terms of actually getting some way to collect this data, we really need to have something that's a bit easier than fresh cut pasture, and the team down at Woodlands will absolutely agree with that. So we have set up a trial which is described in more detail in the posters, to just compare fresh cut grass and lucerne pellets and what the intake is. But we're just at a very much starting point that we have no idea about between animal variability for sheep, maternal breeds, and the repeatability. We talked about what the feed intake the predicted is, so we need to know what traits do we actually need to put into that model. So live weights are easy, but having some concept of body fatness, internal body fat reserves versus just subcutaneous fat. So we're looking at CT versus ultrasound versus just a body condition score. which one of those fat measurements is going to give us the most data. So we're in the middle. The trial finishes this coming week of having 40 hoggets indoors for the last, they went in at the start of July, and so we're starting to get out some of our very first preliminary feed intake data, and it's looking pretty neat to actually show that there is considerable variation in how these animals have actually performed, some random culls out of different flocks down at Woodlands. So, thank you.